Great. Welcome to yet another CIC session. Today, our topic and theme is how to fall in love with a problem. And we have folks here that have worked on a lot of community projects, are about to work on more community projects, and potentially some folks who might apply to the Community Innovation Challenge for 2021. But in general, hopefully this session is useful for anyone watching it that is participating today, but also for anyone who is watching it in posterity as you consider how you're going to approach the problems that I'm sure you can all observe around in your life. So to open the session, my name is Chi Tam. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm actually going to go into the participants panel and hover next to my name to click more. And then I'm going to rename myself with how I prefer to be referred to, which is she and her. And so then you'll be able to see that on my name as well. So feel free to opt for that. And if you don't, I'll just refer to you by your first name throughout the session. All right, so I am calling in today from Toronto, which is Mohawk actually, as the word has evolved, but it sometimes is still spelt with the Tkaronto as well. And it means the place in the water where the trees are standing. And this place has been a very, very multicultural city as I've been learning it, as people have been trying to solve problems on these lands for a long time before today's conversations. I would like to acknowledge that the land that I'm calling in from is part of the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a pre-colonial agreement between folks who were living on these lands, which includes broadly the Anishinaabe and specifically, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and many, many other cultures who have stewarded these lands time and currently, and also are now a huge urban Indigenous population in Toronto specifically, which is quite significant. And the Dish with One Spoon agreement, really, if you haven't had a chance to look into it, is actually quite a simple agreement. It refers to the dish, which is the Lake Ontario, as a shared resource for everyone. And so the idea is that we all wield that spoon very carefully, and we share that resource with other people in mind and don't take more than what we need. The wampum, the two-row wampum is also similar in agreement. It has a similar idea that there's an agreement between settlers and Indigenous folks to this land that we would walk side by side without interference. Now, obviously, that wampum agreement has clearly been violated. So hopefully the big problem of the fact that that's been violated is something that we can walk back towards as we pursue the rest of our community service and thinking about how to tackle these big wicked problems. That's definitely the context in which we're inheriting a lot of these systemic issues. So I think it's actually very, very appropriate that we reflect on where we've come from as we move into this conversation. So I think this topic is fascinating, but I would love you all to introduce yourselves to each other. I've said who I am, and I like thinking about problems. Sometimes it feels like there's too many to choose, but I'm curious about you guys and how you feel about this topic. So I'll ask Abby to introduce themselves first, and then Carla.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name's Abby. I'm currently working with the Ontario Trillium Foundation, and we are definitely a supporter of the CIC challenge. And I'm also located in Toronto, so I am definitely on the lands of Treaty 13. And in terms of falling in love with a problem, I think anybody who works in any sort of community work learns to love the problem. It sort of becomes a real guide to why we do what we do, and it continues to fuel you as you go forward. And I think really sort of falling in love with a problem really roots in trying to understand it from various perspectives, and really sort of helps to also drive innovation. I think that's a key piece, right? Because, we're not solving the same problems by using the same practices and doing the same things over and over again. And so really learning to sort of open yourself up to not knowing and questioning that will really sort of help you not only, look at the problem differently, but also really help to fuel that love for it. So. Oh, and I have a project management background, so we do a lot of these. I have a lot of tools that we use to do this sort of have these conversations and utilize these sort of resources to help guide us through these sort of processes of thinking. I'll turn it over to Carla.
And I am Carla Leon with the United Church of Canada and EDGE, and my pronouns are she, her, also on Treaty 13 and Toronto. And I think in community economic development work, this is why I love this topic as well, is that this is the question. Like, what is the problem? Who is impacted by this? Who's like part of this? And I think that falling in love with the problem is the most important thing, because that's the only way that you're actually able to move forward. So for me, a lot of times when you think about for-profit and other sectors, this is not as important, but I think that this is the work and this is the root of everything that we're talking about.
Amazing. Rana, did you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Rana Teller. You pronounce it like Ramon, but with two N's instead of an M and an N. So Rana Teller, pronouns are he and him. This is my first session with CIC. I am a spiritual leader, specifically a rabbi of a Jewish community in Houston, Texas. And so I appreciate the background of the land that you're living on, and have not really delved into the dramatic issues of the land that I'm sitting on. And so I appreciate that initiative. Falling in love with the problem comes naturally to me as a innovator and progressive. I've never really framed it as falling in love with the problem. I framed it as, what are we doing next? How are we going to move forward? I think this emotional portal of falling in love with the problem is really a beautiful framework that I'm interested in learning more about.
Sally, did you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sally, and I am in Edmonton. I'm with Kirk Center, an incorporated ministry of the United Church of Canada. I try not to think of the things as problems, because I feel like then I find that I'm overwhelmed right off the bat. But that being said, is that when you're working within the sort of community innovation type area, you are consistently facing challenges or problems. So I'm looking forward to sort of hearing what people have to say today, as I am every time I join.
So great. Okay, well, if I can prompt you all to start, it would be lovely to hear maybe your most recent experience of feeling like you found a problem that would, to bring in what Renan was saying, like emotionally sustain you, that like you really feel like you could dedicate time to it and focus on it. How did you come to realize what it was, the shape of it? How did you, have that moment? I'm really curious what the answer is for you all.
Oh my gosh, what a question.
Just the latest one, not like, it doesn't have to be dramatic.
I was gonna go one way, and I'm sorry. I was like, if I don't go now, I'm just not gonna be brave enough to say it.
Okay.
And I'm like, my big thing is just the entire charitable sector and how it's structured. Just small things. The entire system, I think. So I'm just like, how did we even get to the place that things are structured this way? Like, how did we get to the place where the word for-profit is scary to nonprofits and charities, and like social enterprise had to become a new thing because we were so worried about the language about for-profit? And so I don't know if I know exactly what the problem is. I think I'm just wrestling with, like, I know that the way that the charitable sector is right now is not working. I know it needs more innovation. I know it needs new thinking. I know the tools in place are not, it doesn't feel right. Mm. And so I think that until I really start to peel back the onion of what that is, you wouldn't have a way forward because it's so big, right? It's such a big, like just changing the entire system. And I think we've chatted about this before, is like surveys in Canada have been that 65% of the population is dissatisfied with the existing social and economic system in place.
I've lost Carla.
Oh, you did?
Did anyone else? Sorry, it might be my internet. Oh, you did as well? Okay. Would you mind repeating the last minute of what you said?
Oh, no.
Not the whole minute, maybe just the last point.
I just said the 65% of Canadians are dissatisfied with the existing social and economic systems. And I'm like, well, it's because we're thinking about it the way that we were like for the last 500 years. There has to be a different way, if not longer. I don't know. So small things. The entire charitable sector seems small compared to what I think I'm actually describing. So I need to fall in love with this problem more to better understand it. I'll stop.
I'm sort of in lines with you, Carla, in terms of it's a really big problem, and especially looking at the systems view of it, it is so broad. There's so many factors, so many possible things to consider that it also becomes a little overwhelming, right? Either that, or you sort of, makes you step away from it because you're like, wow, this is just too much. Or you just dive in so much that you get into the minutia of things and you almost lose sight of what the actual problem is. Like you've now working on a whole other sort of level where now you're trying to fix the dealing with symptoms of the bigger issue, right? Of the actual problem. And and sort of trying to find that balance between where do you sit with that and that sort of unease, but also feel like you're being action driven and doing the things that are going to make that like contribute to that larger change becomes the challenge, but also the motivation in a lot of ways. And so, but it's like, for me, I'm always like, what is that tipping point, because sometimes, especially doing, work and sort of being, those sort of the shining star and having an idea of what that sort of star is sort of like, how do we get enough people mobilized that we're actually all moving towards it, right? I think that's a huge question in itself, but that I find is a really, if that's something that motivates you, run with it, because we need more individuals doing that mobilization and really trying to drive that. So consider it a strength.
I see us all nodding, but Sally, do you want to elaborate on your comment in the chat?
I have felt exactly what Carla said, that a few times thinking, I'm just going to work on this little thing because I'm working, so Kirk Center works in a community that has its own community league. So they have people that are doing things for Dover Court. So we're trying to think a little bit bigger, and that is having multiple community leagues. But people are so focused on how it's always been, and that is that these community leagues do their own thing. And trying to break that and trying to not break it, just wiggle into the cracks and open up those cracks a little bit to try to like you said, you're mobilizing multiple people and multiple communities that have been very, that have had years and decades of tunnel vision that this is how we work within our own community, and trying to think of the bigger picture and how that can benefit the individual communities, but also the larger community. And it's big and it's overwhelming because there's all these moving parts with all these other community leagues and other people and those people within those community leagues, and trying to put out this vision that isn't how they have been viewing it. So you're this one little voice, trying to make a bigger difference. It's overwhelming sometimes before you even start, and sometimes I back off. And then I'm right in and I'm digging through it, and then I back off because I get overwhelmed. So I'm totally feeling what both Carla and Abby have said here. It's hitting right where I'm thinking.
Rana, just curious what's coming to mind for you.
Yeah, I think I go back to the title of the session, which is the love piece. One of the conundrums that I face as a spiritual leader is emotional sustainability, which means, starting off a project with lots of fanfare and enthusiasm, and then it goes one of two ways. Right? Either you burn out and sort of left behind, or it gets too overwhelming and too hot for the community to handle almost. And so I'm looking for like a slow burn in terms of how to love a problem long term, right, instead of short term. I think the problems we're dealing with here are long-term issues, and certainly medium or long-term issues. If they're short fixes, I think we can handle it on our own. But it's the sustainability that seems to be the issue. Hot topics come and go. And the idea here, I think, is for the love to keep it on a sustainable, emotional, forward-thinking trajectory.
I love your description, and I think I'll be honest that I suspect that when Carla and folks named this session, I don't think the intention or the emphasis was really around unlocking this idea of like the emotional labor involved and like just unlocking just like the actual psychosomatic sustainability of like actually being committed to community service in whatever dimension it is, right? That we all do feel so obliged to. But I actually think like suddenly we've hit totally the key, because like we can use all of these tools to organize ourselves better around analyzing a problem, being more strategic about approaching a problem. But ultimately, like it does at the end of the day, I feel like come back to, have we designed enough little moments of rest? Have we designed enough little moments of honestly rewards to say like we can celebrate these little successes along the way? And are we taking the time to do that in order for us to keep on doing this without burning out, especially in a sector where honestly there's so much unpaid time and volunteer labor going into various initiatives? I think that's huge. So I love the direction we're going in.
Well, and I'm thinking, because I'm with a project management background, I'm very process oriented. And this makes me think about sort of just, not only scheduling check-ins, right, on projects and things like that, and sort of, making sure that you're sort of holding yourself to those dates, right, and make them structured, build them in, put the reminders in so that everybody's on the same page, because it's so easy to forget about them and to really sort of, in a way almost, speaking to what she said about sort of, like the energy goes towards the problem, but maybe some of this project energy really needs to go back to the individuals, right? And we really need to be looking at each other and getting to really sort of check in with each other and setting that time apart, I think is really key. And so building that into sort of all of this work is so essential. And then just reminders of self-care. Like, I think it's, we do this, all this is really sort of free labor and we do it from a place of passion and commitment and dedication. But we also need to, take a breath sometimes, right? And also recognize all of those, like she said, all the rewards, the small rewards along the way. It's so important to be able to keep momentum going and to keep other people sort of aligned with the purpose and the values, and reminding along the way. Those check-ins are really opportunities for that, to really draw the person back in, because we all are in these spaces for personal reasons, like, and sort of not forgetting that, I think, is really essential. So.
No, this is good. I love, like, it does tie with some of our other sessions when it comes to like falling in love with the problem, and like that vision that it's the common thing that you're all going towards, right? That you're trying to solve together. What I think is really fascinating, what was kind of hitting for me, is that like, what is success and what's the win? Ironically, it means that we're not needed, right? And so all of the things are like band-aids or like things that are happening to address the system. But really, when we know we're successful, is because we no longer need restorative justice care. We no longer need soup kitchens, right? Like, that's the challenge that comes into all of this. And so when do you know that you've hit it? It's like that's kind of an odd type of reward. Like, oh yeah, now you're not needed. Oh, great. It's kind of this.
Well, the reward is to like sit back, relax, and just watch the community thrive. Like ideally, right? I'm sipping tea on a patio and like just in this adorable urban village scene. In my mind, that's like the vision of where I am in relation to it all. Totally. I do want to get a little bit into like the actual steps, because I do feel like the spark is not actually usually the hard part. I think people come to look for resources and look for sessions like this after they've already identified that spark, after they've had that connection, or have a vague idea of where they're going with a project that they have in mind. So I am curious, like after the last session, which was like priority setting and kind of defining the problem a bit, what are your next 2 steps in terms of what are tools that you guys have leaned on to understand it better, to like start diving into it better? What are your next instincts after that?
So for me, I always ask myself, who else? I think if there's a real problem and we've sort of, I'm like, this is something, there's something here, there's potential here, right? It's like, who else? And I want to, find a way to gather people, right? And really sort of, working with community in that space, and also making sure that there's, really diverse perspectives at the table and potentially all levels, like we don't, like, it's great to have, a table of leaders if you can, all sitting around the table, but their perspectives are, their perspectives. Let's broaden that a little bit and really, think outside the box a little bit about who we're engaging and who's sitting at the table with us for that conversation. And then once you've got a team together, there's such a potential there to really sort of start digging deeper into, some of those, root causes, right? And really sit there and give yourself the time to dig a little deeper, because you want to make sure that you're, any sort of actions that you're taking are really addressing the root causes of the problem, because otherwise you're just, like I mentioned before, band-aiding or looking at symptoms of the issue, and in the long term, the outcome is not likely going to be the one that you were hoping for.
Totally agree. And I think the who else was so interesting, like that's for sure number 1 for me as well. And then remind myself to stop, because I think it's so often we jump to the solution so quickly, and we just, like you said, they come in and they're like, okay, like I have an inkling that this is the direction. Like, question all your assumptions. Like, you need to stop and do what Abby was saying, is like really start to dig into the problem a little bit. So like resist the urge to say, no, I'm pretty sure this is already the way. Like, I'm pretty sure you're going to be wrong. So you got to go back a little bit. And what Abby said, like the root cause, the way I do that is I actually draw a tree and I put what I think my problem is on the trunk, and then I treat the leaves as my symptoms to see like what I'm seeing, right? Which would be the leaves. And then with the problem, well, what are the root causes? And starting to see the root causes to the symptoms, and seeing then the full problem as this tree, with the trunk being the thing I thought it was, but seeing how all these pieces are actually interrelated.
That's very similar to like doing a fishbone diagram. If anybody's seen that before, it literally just looks like the bones of a fish, and really sort of looking at having the problem as sort of the head of the fish, and then really, each sort of bigger bone or the large key bones are all of the sort of, factors that you've sort of brainstormed, right, with your team around, what is causing this problem. And then from there, start asking the whys, right, around why is that? Why is this happening? And then continue to do it. There's a 5 whys method. I don't know if you always have to do 5. I mean, it's really, more up to the group to decide, how deep is enough for us. But that's a really great way to sort of just unravel and really see visually, how things are related, how they're intersecting, if there are there causes that are duplicated, right, that you're finding in different spaces, and, what does that mean? And sort of being able to sort of visualize it, I find it is extremely helpful.
Sally, do you have anything you want to jump in on that point? All good if not.
Right. I was just like, why is it so bright in here? Yeah, no, sorry, no, but I absorbed, but I don't think that I have anything to say. Sorry.
I love that. And I think besides why and who, you can actually just go through the standard questions, fill those out a little bit more for yourself. And then do another check-in with yourself. It's like, am I still interested in this? Is this still something that I would be willing to devote time, and I can see like a structure building around it. But then I think what I would say is also to look the other direction, to like do a little bit of an analysis of yourself and your relationship to the problem, because I think that will unlock a lot of answers as to how deep you can go from your positionality, literally on the typical axes of like race and gender, et cetera, that will help you realize, like, are you in a position of like a lot of privilege in relation to this specific problem, or are you acting from it from like from the person being targeted by this systemic problem? And that actually hugely changes what avenues are available to you in order to address it or leverage. And like, it does not preclude you from doing something about it, but it does unlock a lot of the next to-do list items if you decide to commit to that specific problem. So I would really encourage folks to also, as a first instinct, look the other direction as well, because I think that's a useful exercise.
Yeah, no, I think there's some really interesting things about, well, I'll give an example of what Greenhouse does. So Greenhouse is basically an innovation arm incubator that's attached to the University of Waterloo or St. Paul's College. Mm-hmm. And they really support social entrepreneurs, and they spend like months on falling in love with the problem. And the way that they do that is obviously focus groups. They actually will like map out the day in the life of the person impacted, always ensuring that the people who are impacted are actually part of co-creating what it looks like. Mm-hmm. And so it is like, really, that is what understanding the problem means, or falling in love with it means in its most raw form.
I think a question people will have about, well, first in relation to the CIC challenge, but also for their own projects in general, will be like, do I have to love my problem? Because, you know, there are things that, like, not everything has to meet this very high threshold, I feel. So what do you guys think? Like, where should people hold their standards to and their judgments as they go along with exploring?
If you don't love the problem, I think you might want to ask yourself why. Because this work it takes time, it takes effort, it really takes dedication. And, you know, if you're looking to address especially larger systemic issues, I personally think the love needs to be there in some shape or form, right? And if it's not, then maybe it's also recognizing that maybe you're not the one to be leading this work, mm-hmm. which is okay too, right? Like like she said, sometimes we need to take a step back from ourselves and really think about and allow the work and give the work the, all of that dedication and all of that love that it deserves. And so I think the why comes up again as a question there if you're not in love with it.
And I see this all the time with for-profit as well. Like on the for-profit side, if the entrepreneur isn't passionate, like the business is not going to fly. So like, it's exactly the same. And I always have entrepreneurs ask me, like, how do I know that I'm like passionate? Like, if you have to ask if you're in love, you're not in love. Like, it's as simple as that.
Yeah, I think that is a good basic test for folks to to check in with themselves about. I am curious about more examples, actually. Like I think it's useful when people think of specific examples. What other, like, there could be a huge diversity of methods of like how people, depending on their personality, but also depending on the type of group, would start analyzing a problem like that. And I feel like sometimes like very different methods are appropriate. So are there other examples of organizations that you've come across where you either thought it was a really outstanding example or a really unusual example that you wanted to share with the group.
I think it's starting somewhere, right? And I think scope of your problem is really important, right? So we've talked about systemic issues and like how overwhelming they can be. And maybe that's not where you have to start. Like that problem's not going to go away. Like it's still there, right? So maybe you start with something that's like something more manageable. And I know that there is a group of community organizers who really just wanted to make a more resilient community. But then they realized like that's a lot of pieces. That's not the whole thing. Like we can't do that. And so they really were able to focus down and say, well, actually, when we're looking at this, food is one of the things, and food deserts is one thing we want to focus on, and social isolation and leadership empowerment. Those are 3 things. And even from there, from the last time we talked about prioritizing which one to go into. And so the people in the room, like we said, the self-reflection, they were like, well, I actually own a farm. This other person's like, well, actually, I'm affiliated with a food bank. And this other person's like, well, actually, I have a commercial kitchen in a building that I like. So it started to become pretty obvious that if they're going to chew on something there, literally chew on something, they're going to start with the food. Right? I think that was like a good way to go. Another organization decided to start with food, and they realized they couldn't like change the entire system. But so it wasn't the entire like solving food poverty or access to, like they didn't do the whole thing. But what they said is that out of the continuum of people who have access or in access to food, maybe these are the group that we can focus on. And so this organization is called Operation Sharing. It's out of Woodstock. And they worked with the local grocery stores to donate a percentage of every sale into this, so that there was actually, they alleviated food poverty for all of Woodstock, right? That's a great solution. It's not the full solution of the full food poverty challenge in Woodstock, but it was good for that area. So after like literally a decade of running that and growing that and like making as much impact as they can, they then go, we're ready for the next part of what this problem is. So you don't have to eat the elephant, pardon all the food analogies, you don't have to eat the entire elephant at once. It's just one bite at a time.
I'm thinking of examples that I know of in like the city planning space. So for some people, for Friends of Chinatown, Toronto. So they have a specific story that shot them into the mainstream media, which was their first campaign. They were mostly a group of artists. There were architects and there were pharmacists. There were all sorts of types of people, but the majority of the core group that wanted to address the problem of folks not being able to access the city planning process and more development notices going up in their neighborhood. They wanted translation services. They had identified the problem very clearly, but then to make the problem sort of that it was inherently antagonizing them and inherently something that frustrates them and kind of actually has a lot of negative emotions for them, they decided to approach it with like a lot of style and flair, and just like they approached it in a very authentic way to the fact that the majority of them were artists. And so they decided to do a parody of a city development application and just like used all of their art skills to completely replicate it perfectly. And it was like it almost looked like a public art installation. Like it played on the idea of a city development notice in and of itself. And I feel like even if the problem itself, like on its own, is not inherently, something that calls you by its nature, but just like is frustrating enough that you really want to do something about it, I feel like bringing that like authenticity of just like the sheer facts of who you are is like another great way to actually make it just like authentic and enjoyable for you to work on. And I think the fact that it like there was a way to respond to it as an art project made sense for this group. And I feel like that's like a pretty clear example of how they could have done otherwise. And then a different offshoot of that group, now is thinking about more long-term responses. So they're thinking about a community land trust. And then they are majority researchers. So like what they know how to do is like to map stuff out, to go around and survey the neighborhood. And like that was also very authentic to them and how they approach things. So honestly, I would say that the two are approaching the same problem. They just love it very differently and they love it in different ways. So I would also consider that if I were thinking about a new problem to approach. So we are, I think, almost at the end of the session, but I wondered if you guys had any more questions for each other on this theme.
Sometimes I find that a problem branches, you sort of start where you think you've got one, but actually you've got multiple. And for me, I find that, well, for me, I find I'm only one person was what I was going to say, but I guess everybody finds they're only one person. But in our organization, I'm one person. And so I find it difficult when it does branch to prioritize. Sometimes because it's just difficult to change priorities when you feel like you had a focus and you need to change. Sometimes you just need to get up the oomph to do that, to just make that happen for yourself. Other times, I just find it's just not clear what, or sometimes when you're involved with other people, the other branches pop out and everybody's got a different interest of that branch, and that's why the branches have come out. So now you actually find that your little group is divided and now everybody's heading off in different directions, but no one person is going to make it happen alone. So trying to reel it back in and so when you had those sort of moments where things have branched out, any thoughts on how to then group everybody back into a priority, but without insulting what other people thought were other priorities?
So one, I think an important thing is to bring all those people together and have a conversation about this, right? Because this all, if you were all aligned on purpose at the beginning before these sort of branches occurred, which is very natural and happens, I think, for everybody. And then you start seeing other people's passions, like where they start leaning in those branches, right? Which is great because those are likely things that need to be taken care of, are priorities as well for them. But to really sort of bring everybody back and, I keep saying mapping, but like put it all out visually and then get people to rank them or rate things. I think, taking people out of it and being, looking at this is the problem we're trying to address, right? These are all the possible solutions, angles, directions we should go in. Let's prioritize so that we're putting our resources towards the ones that are the most, most likely to lead to a potential solution or in that direction, and the ones that we all agree together is the direction that we should be moving in, because that realignment is really going to help. And then, documenting that, I'm always like, document it and share it so that everybody knows and everybody's held accountable, right? Because I think that's a part of the branching happens also is when people aren't totally clear on what their next step should be. Some people may go on tangents and, to sort of just make sure that we're keeping everybody, focused on the goal and understanding the goal is really going to help sort of, allow for that transparency across as well.
I definitely agree on having almost once you're able to see everything to kind of have that one place that because it allows people to see if they're in or if they're out. Right. So, and it's okay. You're not going to have everyone. I think that a lot of community economic development work and all of this work is rooted in some of the best practices from open space technology. Like the people in the room are the right people. Like the time it takes is how long it's going to take. Like there's certain things that sometimes in this work, we do have to give ourselves some grace. So maybe not as concrete of ways forward for you, Sally, as what Abby gave, but also remembering to give yourself some grace. I mean, this is like herding cats. It is tricky work.
Thank you. Yeah, that's yeah, you're right. I think you're right. That's so simple. Abby, but you're right. Just getting everybody in, laying out all the branches that came out of the woodwork, and just deciding what we can get done first, and prioritizing and what is possible with what we've got. That's really easy to follow, and not easy for me to follow, but easy for the group to follow. Also easy for me to follow, which is nice.
And it also gives you something to reflect back on later, right? Like, I think it's also important to continue to, look at your progress and where you're going, and checking in, and, doing those sort of check-ins with everybody, because it will keep you focused a longer term, right? If you sort of have this sort of foundation that you've all built together, and then you can really sort of branch out the way that is going to still sort of come together and sort of make that whole leafy tree. I like the tree, Carla, over the fishbone. That's really
Everything good. I really love, because what you just talked about, though, it reinforces when she asked what first. The first is who else, right? Because doing all that work, having that common understanding, having everything written out, and then adding 5 more people means you have to do it again. So I love, like,
also, I think sometimes that's why it's tempting to try and go it alone, like initially. It's tempting to just sort of like skip that step, because you're like, no, I know what the problem is, and or like, or you're like just in it and you can't see and you can't see that actually there are other people that could totally shoulder the burden with you. Sally, I just want to say that when you sighed at the end of when you asked the question, it was so relatable. Like, the sigh came from a very real place, and I want to honor that. I like this idea that, like, once you call everyone together, it could also be framed as like a celebration. It's like, look at how many branches you guys acted on, like go you guys, like that's incredible. That's such an expression of like hope and like commitment to community. And then, but at the same time, like, I kind of need a couple priorities here, guys. So it was like, it doesn't have to be like a, hey, everyone's going off the rails kind of conversation. I feel like it could be a moment of actually like acknowledging and celebrating them for it.
I actually feel like it also can, maybe upon thinking about it, can actually put up a bit of a future map. Because you think you're working on this one thing, and then you've got all these branches, and once you sit down and really decide maybe what order these things can be done in, you might actually find that you've put forward months of work and sort of a way in which you're going to make that happen, or a plan to make that happen. I mean, plans change also, but you might actually find that you're starting to see a bigger result or a bigger picture in mapping out that.
Indeed. All right, I'm inviting any last closing thoughts or advice to anyone else who in future is considering a problem and considering submitting a challenge.
Sure.
I think the takeaway here is that people really are our biggest resource, right? They're essential to our work, and we need to keep that centered moving forward. But also, I think the problem, I think the word problem, we should use a different word because that carries a lot for people. And so sort of trying to reframe it, and potentially coming from a place of really learning, because that's really what this is. We don't know the answers. All we can do is really test and experiment ideas of what we think solutions are. And so come from a space of learning and bring people along for that learning. And I think that's really going to, really help sort of bring more people in together and continue the sort of, movement forward together.
Carla, could I invite you to also close, but then invite people to submit a CIC, like EOI, in case they're interested?
Right. Yeah, no, I think that fall in love was an accident, as you named, and yet it seemed like it was the perfect word to use. So I think that was when you double checked with us, do you have to love it? And we both were like, yeah, you do. I think that was important. So what the good news is, this is, I think, the fourth workshop that we've had. And so basically, we've talked about how to gather people. We've talked about how to build those partnerships. Now, how do we prioritize? How do we actually fall in love with the problem? Well, guess what? If you want to do the Community Innovation Challenge, you're pretty much ready. You basically have your partners in place then from that. Yes, Sally. And then you have your 4 partners in place. You have a common understanding of what your priority is. You've now framed it as a problem. So now you can go to socialinnovationchallenge.ca, submit your expression of interest, and plan when you want to do your design jam, is what it's called, or your actual Community Innovation Challenge. Making you eligible for $2,000 of seed funding to get off the ground, whatever idea that you and your partners co-create based on this problem you now have identified. So we're excited to see what happens.
Thank you all so much for your time and for spending it with me. I apologize again to anyone who wanted to come to the session but was unable to find the correct location. We will be with you again next week. Join us for the next session. And please do consider hosting a challenge wherever you may be.